Hey guys, this is going to be a video all about the differences between a hand-drawn stencil which is then scanned into Photoshop and printed out onto thermal paper, and as opposed to just loading up a photograph and applying a filter to it and printing that out and using that as a stencil. If you haven't seen it already, I've made a video on the differences between hectograph paper and thermal paper. I'll stick a card up on there, you can click on the link if you want to watch that video first. But this video is solely focusing on thermal paper, which is this stuff here, which can go through a dot matrix printer or a thermal printer. So I've chose this picture because this is a tattoo I've done recently. It was a cover-up, or part of a cover-up that I did, and it's a picture of John Lennon. Now, for me personally, whenever I do a portrait or anything like that, I like to take the time, I get the reference image, I get some hectograph paper, I lay the reference image on top, and I work from bottom to top and go over it with my pencil and start picking out all the details, all the shadows and everything that I think is going to help me pull the tattoo off. So I'm just going to flip to a video of the wipe down of the tattoo that I actually did, so you can see that, and then we'll come back to this. So here's the tattoo that I did, and you can see that I'm just wiping off, and that's the portrait of John Lennon that I did, and I'm going to show you the stencil that I used for that actual tattoo. Okay, so we're back again. What I personally did, like I say, I went over, took my time with my pencil and picked out all the details of the reference image, and then when I've turned it over, obviously I'll have a print of my stencil on there. And then from there, what I'd do, I'd take this sheet of paper with the stencil on the back of it, I'll put it into my scanner, scan that through into my computer, and then load that up onto Photoshop, and then I will have a picture of my stencil. And I'll show you that picture. And here it is. So this is the stencil that I made for this reference image, and for the tattoo that you've just seen. This is the stencil that I actually used. I'll just get a little close up on that, and you can see it's got detail in there, but it's not overdone, and that's how I like to do my stencils, and it's purely personal preference. You know, there's no right way or wrong way of doing it, it's just down to personal preference, and at the end of the day, it's just getting enough detail on there so you can enough to pull the tattoo off. Some people prefer to go more detail, some people prefer to go less. That's just personally for me, and you can see between there, hopefully you can pick out and work out what I've done. Like, let's for example say these lines here, these dotted lines, then obviously this is, I've picked out the shade around the face there. Again, you got these dotted lines coming around here, around the nose, and that represents to me this shade coming around here, around his nose, and just little things like that. You know, it's a stencil is basically a roadmap. It's basically so you know that when you come into actually do this tattoo, all the information on your stencil is enough to pull off the tattoo that you're doing. Now, another way of doing a stencil for this, like I say, if you've watched the previous video where I show you how to apply a Photoshop filter, you can actually apply a filter to this image on Photoshop without the need of tracing around this, you know, and making this stencil. And I've applied the filter just so you can see and compare the two, but this is what it looks like when you apply a filter to this image, and that's what you get. And you can see it's quite grainy, but all the details there. Now, like I've said, there's no right way or wrong way of doing this, it's just your preferred way. But I'm going to tell you my personal thoughts of using this and also using this. So these are the two side by side. So this is my hand-drawn stencil, this is a Photoshop filter over a stencil. Now, sometimes I do use filters for stencils, but usually only if it's like quite a simple design. But anything portraits or anything like that, you know, like animals, realism, I never use this sort of stencil, the Photoshop filter. And the reason being that I personally don't use it is because you see all these little dots, all these little bits of grainy bits and all this, all around the eyes, you know, and you've got all this like mottled sort of look going on. When this transfers to the skin as a stencil, it can get quite confusing, I personally think anyway. There's a lot of artists that do use this and are absolutely fantastic artists, so like I say, I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm just saying it's a personal preference to me, which is why I don't use it. And for me, like I say, when this is on the skin, it gets too complicated, there's too much going on, there's too much purple everywhere, and you know, if you're tattooing like down here, I always start, you know, from bottom to top, but sometimes when you're tattooing, as you'll know, like the side of your hand or something will catch your stencil, and when you've got all this purple going on the skin anyway, and you smudge a bit like that, it starts making more of a mess, and the whole thing, for me personally, it just gets a bit too messy. So I prefer a much cleaner cut stencil. So I take the time and I go for something like this. And every time, like I say, if I'm doing a portrait or anything like that, or anything like that's going to be like quite complicated or a little bit challenging, then I will always break it down to this. Another good thing about doing it like this is, once you've done this stencil and you print it out on paper like this, you can actually then start going over your stencil with a pencil. And I do this a lot as well when I'm doing portraits. So what I do is I basically like test my stencil before I tattoo it. So I'll get a pencil, I'll check my reference image, and I'll start redrawing the whole design. Just to make sure that my drawing looks exactly like my reference image. And it's kind of like a fail-safe way of approaching a tattoo like this. And some people argue, yeah, but that's just taking loads of time. But for me, you know, if you're taking on a job like this, you need to invest the time. You can't just take on a job like this and just go, oh well, it doesn't matter, we'll see if it works, because your reputation's just going to go down the pan otherwise, and no one's going to come back to you if you mess it up. So I like to really take the time with stuff like this, and for this particular job, I redrew the whole thing over my stencil and compared it. And sometimes I've had stencils where I've started redrawing them, and then I cross-reference my reference image, and it just doesn't look like the reference image. It looks like a decent drawing, but with portraits it needs to be on point, it needs to be 100%. And sometimes I've had stencils where I've done, like, say, the eyes, and there's just something not quite right. So then I've gone back and looked at the stencil, and then maybe like I've done the eye just a slightly too big, or you know, or the pupil's not aligned right, and then when I've come to redrawing it, I've seen, and it's like, oh, that's not right. So what I do is I scrap it, throw the stencil away, start again, and I do another stencil, and then I'll redraw it again. And when my drawing's right, that's when I know I can tattoo it. And like I say, it's like a fail-safe way of doing it. It does take a lot more prep time, but you know, if you're doing stuff like this, I think I do really believe that you need to put the legwork in anyway, because the last thing you need to be doing is in a situation where you've just quickly done off a stencil, stuck it on the skin, start tattooing it, and then go, oh, this doesn't look like this person. It looks like a person, but doesn't look like this person, or animal, or whatever it is you're tattooing. You know, if someone's come in, they've specifically asked for a tattoo, and they brought in a reference image with them, you need to make sure that tattoo, when it's finished, looks like the reference image and not something completely different. So I can't stress enough, like I say, this isn't the wrong way of doing it, and there's guys on YouTube that I've seen, there's guys that only use this method and just apply a filter and they stick it on, and when I see it on the skin, I'm like, wow, you know, there's a lot of detail on there, there's a lot of purple on there, but you see them just chilling away with the machine, and then they wipe off at the end and it's like perfect, and that works for them. But personally for me, I do it like this, put the legwork in, and I think if you do just put that extra effort in, you'll go a lot further, and your work will look so much better than as opposed to not putting any time into it. So that was my video on hand-drawn stencil versus the Photoshop filter. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and there's loads more videos on the way soon. Cheers, guys.